Looking back, I wish I could say the uneasy feeling I had that day was fleeting. A passing moment of self-doubt. But it was more than that. It wasn't the first time I had felt out of place at my husband's work events. But this time the sensation went beyond discomfort. It lodged itself deep within me. An unshakable presence that followed me even after we had left the hotel. The days after the party, I replayed everything over and over in my head. It wasn't just the subtle glances or the casual physical touches, it was the air of familiarity between my husband and his female colleagues that gnawed at me. They knew him in ways I didn't. They understood the ins and outs of his work life. His jokes. His stress. And the victories he shared with them. That knowledge felt like a wall between us. One I hadn't even noticed had been built. At home, our lives had become increasingly compartmentalized over the past few years. We had our routine. Our shared meals. Our weekend plans. But his work life? That was something separate. Something I was only privy to through passing comments or occasional work dinners. He never intentionally shut me out. At least not in any overt way. But it was clear that he had created a life that existed parallel to ours. A world where I didn't quite fit in. I started to feel the weight of it all. The loneliness. The isolation. The feeling of being a bystander in my own marriage. It was a slow, creeping realization that didn't come all at once but settled in layers. Like the buildup of dust on forgotten furniture. With every passing day, I felt more invisible. More disconnected from him. And from the person I thought I was in his life. I couldn't shake the memory of that night. I couldn't let go of the image of him laughing. So relaxed and at ease. With people who seemed to know him better than I did. I wondered if I had become the stranger in our relationship. If somehow, over time, we had grown apart without me even realizing it. Had I been blind? Or was I just now seeing things for what they truly were? There's a certain kind of betrayal that doesn't come from infidelity or lies. But from realizing that the person you love has parts of themselves they've chosen not to share with you. And that was the crux of it. That night, I realized my husband had a life I wasn't a part of. Not just a work life, but an emotional life. A sphere of connection with other people that excluded me. It was a painful realization. And it left me questioning everything. I started to distance myself. Emotionally and physically. I became quieter around him. Retreating into my own thoughts. No longer feeling the need to share the little details of my day. What was the point? He had his own confidants now. People who understood his life in ways I couldn't. I was no longer his sounding board. His partner in navigating the stresses of life. Instead, I felt like a shadow. Hovering in the background. Unseen and unheard. He didn't seem to notice the change at first. Or maybe he did. But chose not to address it. We both went through the motions. Pretending nothing had shifted. But it had. We didn't talk about the party. Or the women I had noticed. Or the way I felt in that room full of people who seemed closer to him than I was. I waited for him to say something. To reassure me. To notice that I was hurting. But the conversation never came. And with each passing day, my resentment grew. I began to wonder if this was my fault. Had I withdrawn too much? Had I let my insecurities get the best of me? I replayed our marriage in my mind. Trying to find the moment when things had changed. When I had become an outsider in his life. Was it when he got the promotion? When he started traveling more for work? Or had it happened slowly? Over the course of years. Slipping past unnoticed until it was too late to fix. There's a kind of isolation that comes from being in a relationship where the person next to you feels like a stranger. It's the silence that fills the gaps where there used to be conversation. The empty spaces where connection once thrived. I tried to tell myself that this was just a rough patch. That every marriage has its ups and downs. But deep down, I knew this was different. One evening, as I sat alone in our living room, my husband working late again, I found myself scrolling through old photos. There we were. Smiling on vacations. At family gatherings. At the parties we used to throw together. We looked happy. In love. So connected. I stared at those pictures for what felt like hours. Searching for some sign of the disconnect that had come to define us. But it wasn't there. We had been happy. truly happy. So what had changed? I thought back to the first few years of our marriage, when we would talk for hours about everything. Our dreams, our fears, our future. There was an intimacy between us then. A shared sense of purpose. A belief that we were building something together. But somewhere along the way, that intimacy had faded. We had stopped having those deep conversations. We had stopped being vulnerable with each other. The realization hit me hard. We had let our marriage become transactional. A series of obligations and responsibilities, with no room for the emotional connection that had once been the foundation of our relationship. And the work party had been the tipping point. The moment when I saw, for the first time, how far apart we had drifted. I wanted to blame him. To say that he had shut me out. That he had chosen his work and his colleagues over me. But the truth was, I had let it happen too. I had stopped trying. Stopped fighting for our connection. And now I was paying the price. That night, as I lay in bed beside him, I felt an overwhelming sense of loss. Not just for what we had lost as a couple, but for the person I had been before this all happened. I used to be confident, self-assured, secure in who I was and what I brought to our marriage. But now, I felt like a shell of that person, consumed by doubt and insecurity. I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know if it could be fixed. All I knew was that the hurt I felt, the violation I had experienced at that work party, wasn't just about that one night. It was about everything that had led up to it. The years of emotional distance. The slow erosion of our connection. The unspoken truths that had built up between us. In the weeks that followed, I tried to bring it up with him. I wanted to talk about how I felt. About the growing distance between us. But every time I tried, the words got stuck in my throat. How do you tell someone you love that you feel like they've abandoned you, even when they are still physically present? How do you explain the kind of loneliness that comes from being in a room with the person you've built your life with, and still feeling completely alone? Eventually, the silence between us became unbearable. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. So one evening, as we sat in the living room, him engrossed in his laptop, I turned to him and said, "We need to talk." He looked up, surprised, and for a brief moment, I saw a flicker of concern in his eyes. But as I started to speak, explaining how I had felt since the party, how I had been feeling for months, that flicker faded. He listened, nodding occasionally, but I could tell he wasn't really hearing me. And when I finished, there was a long, uncomfortable silence. "I'm sorry you feel that way," he finally said, his voice distant. "But I don't know what you want me to do." It was the response I had been dreading. The kind of dismissive apology that only made me feel more alone. In that moment, I realized that he didn't understand. And maybe he never would. The chasm between us had grown too wide. And I didn't know if we could ever bridge it. In the days that followed, we fell back into our routine. But something had shifted. The unspoken tension hung between us like a thick fog. And I found myself wondering if this was the beginning of the end. Could we find our way back to each other? Or had too much damage been done? As I sit here now, months later, reflecting on that work party and everything that has happened since, I still don't have the answers. I don't know if our marriage will survive, or if the hurt I felt that night will ever fully heal. What I do know is that I wasn't wrong for feeling hurt and violated. That night was a wake-up call. A moment of clarity that forced me to confront the truth about our relationship. And while I may never be able to fully explain why that night affected me so deeply, I've come to realize that my feelings are valid. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't overreacting. What I experienced that night was the culmination of years of emotional distance. And the realization that something fundamental had changed between us. Now, as I sit with that truth, I know that the only way forward is to be honest with myself about what I need and what I deserve. Whether or not my husband and I can rebuild what we've lost, only time will tell. But for now, I'm learning to trust my own feelings. To listen to that voice inside me that tells me when something isn't right. Because if there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that my feelings matter. And no matter what happens next, Whether my husband and I can rebuild our relationship or not. I will no longer ignore the voice inside that tells me something is wrong. In the end, I've come to realize that it's not about being right or wrong. It's about being true to myself. Feeling hurt. Feeling violated. It was a reflection of something deeper. Something I had been trying to push aside for too long. I owe it to myself to stop brushing aside my emotions. To stop convincing myself that my discomfort is invalid. I still don't know where we'll end up. But for the first time in a long time, I'm clear on one thing: I deserve more than feeling like a spectator in my own marriage. I deserve to be heard. To be seen. To be valued. And whether that happens within this marriage or on my own, I won't settle for anything less. That night at the work party may have broken something between us. But it also awakened something within me. And maybe that's the beginning of something new. A journey toward reclaiming my voice, my worth, and my happiness.